Thank you all for tuning back into the show. Today I have with me Dr. Daniel Halliday. He earned his PhD in philosophy from Stanford University in 2011. Dan is a senior lecturer here at the University of Melbourne. He works mainly on subjects relating to justice and political economy. He recently published a book with his co-author John Thrasher on the subject matter he covers in his second semester subject here at the University of Melbourne, called The Ethics of Capitalism. The book goes by the same name. He also hosted a television series on ABC called Ethics Matters that featured, among other philosophers, the Ormond alumnus Peter Singer. If you're a student here at the university and you're looking for a subject to do this semester, I strongly recommend The Ethics of Capitalism. I did it last year, and it's not too late to change. You can change your enrollment up until Friday of the second week. So I strongly recommend that if you're on the fence about one of your other subjects, maybe you should consider changing to The Ethics of Capitalism. And hopefully this podcast will give you a little bit of a teaser as to the kinds of things that you'll run into in the subject. Of course, there's a lot more in the subject than we're able to touch on here, and of course you go into a lot more depth. You can find Dan at danhalliday.net. And now I give you Dr. Daniel Halliday. All right, thanks so much for joining me today, Daniel. So you've recently released a book, The Ethics of Capitalism, which is meant to be a kind of companion text for, people looking to teach an introductory course on the subject. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I should say I co-authored it with my friend,
yes, of course.
John Thrasher. But yes, it's a cut and dried textbook. I mean, we've tried to write it so that it could be used, I think, primarily for introductory classes, but also for more advanced classes, if there's going to be a inclusion of primary texts as well. But yes, that's about right.
And if you're an interested member of the public, this is still something you could get into, couldn't you?
That's the hope, yes. You may not want to do the study questions at the end of each chapter, but yeah, we tried to write it so that it's easy to read and that it doesn't presuppose too much knowledge. So yeah.
So I took your class last year, and the book was still being developed at that point. And I must say, though, I was very impressed with, the class. It was really good, and you did a great job of teaching it. So I'd like to heap that praise on you now.
Well, that's very kind. That's very kind of you, Josh. It was a lot of fun writing the book and teaching the material. And in many ways, writing this sort of material is more fun than, writing conventional journal articles and other kinds of books. So I'm glad you enjoyed it too at the student end.
Yeah, I think, you did a good job of remaining unbiased and, introducing, a lot of concepts in a way that, stopped people from reflexively, being against them necessarily. I think you definitely opened my eyes up to a lot of problems that we have, especially with the current system. And I think it was a very positive experience in that way.
Great. Yeah, well, you mentioned that we're unbiased. I mean, hopefully that's true. But one of the nice things about writing a textbook is you don't have to make up your own mind. You just have to sort of give an impression of, the complexity of the debate or the complexity of the problem, perhaps in some cases the shallowness of the debate. But yeah, again, that's one of the nice things about writing this is that, well, we just have to kind of draw people's attention to what's interesting and what's challenging and what they might not have thought about. Don't have to try and persuade people of too much.
Yeah, so I'd like to get into what you actually think maybe a little bit later on, but let's introduce some of these ideas first, and then that'd be interesting because, I think because you were teaching this class, you probably weren't bringing too many of your views to the table in a lot of ways. And I want to know, now that you've thought about these various problems, what you think should be done, but maybe we'll get to that a little bit later on.
Sure.
So One of the things that you introduce in the book is this Google search where you type in capitalism is, and it auto fills out a bunch of different things like dead, dying, bad, slavery, and since the outbreak of COVID, there's now the virus as well. Why do you think capitalism has all of these negative connotations latched onto it?
Great. Yeah, that's a good place to start. And yes, you're right. You do get these autocompletes. They're a little bit different from computer to computer, and they're a little bit different over time. When I first did this, the one that really stood out was capitalism is the root of all evil, which seems to have disappeared in recent searches. But yeah, what these autocompletes are supposed to tell us is what people generally think. I mean, I'm not an expert on the internet, but they're supposed to be suggested because they reflect the kind of complete sentences or phrases that people have been putting into the search engines. So it looks like capitalism's got a bit of a bad reputation, or people tend to think of it negatively. And that squares with a lot of the experiences that I was having, and I dare say most people have, when they look for news stories on capitalism, or when they just browse opinion pieces, or when they just hear people talking on the radio or even in the street. And it might help to say a little bit about the origins of the subject.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there's the book, which is what we're talking about. But the book really did evolve out of the class that I still teach at Melbourne University, right? And it was really, the book only exists because the class exists. The book kind of got written, well, the book kind of got conceived by accident. I ended up teaching this class, The Ethics of Capitalism, right? Same name as the book. And I thought, okay, it's time we had a class on sort of economic justice. There wasn't really one in the university. And although I've been teaching political philosophy and practical ethics, there hadn't really been an economic focus in my teaching. And I felt there was time to branch out a bit. And I started off just by, before you took the class, there was no draft textbook, right? The first year or two, what I did is I just gave students, primary sources. So I gave them material from Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill and other historical figures who still feature quite prominently in the book, along with a bunch of contemporary articles and chapters.
I think that's another really good element of the book, is that it does give time to these original thinkers, and often, you have, the contemporary thinkers, but they don't tend to stick around. The original thinkers will sort of always remain there in some sense, and people will be riffing off their ideas. So I think it's always important to talk about them.
Yeah, well, the original figures, or at least people like Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill, were much more ambitious, and they were able to be more ambitious because they weren't, people like me, who work in universities. Nowadays, there's a much more pressure to be hyper specialized, which is one way of making progress. But it's sort of affected teaching in a certain kind of way, and I wanted to sort of do something a bit more ambitious, or a little bit more sweeping in its scope. And so, yeah, you do go back to those old figures. But another reason for going back to the old figures is they actually liked capitalism. They actually thought this was worth defending morally. And it's fair to say they wouldn't be happy with how things have turned out. But in a way, that's the hook for the book. Right? Well, one of the hooks for the book is people used to think capitalism had moral foundations. No one really thinks that now, at least not so far as the autocompletes would suggest. So what went wrong? And the book is kind of an attempt to figure out, well, why did people like it? What can we learn from that? But
this leads into another interesting point, which is that free markets play a lot better than capitalism in people's minds, and so linking this back into the origins of the word. Smith didn't come up with this word, did he? It was something that Marx used, and he used it in reference to a class of people.
Yeah, that's absolutely the word capitalism. Really, I don't know if Marx was the very first person to use it, but he was certainly the person to popularize it. And anyway, the word evolved out of opponents or critics of capitalism. Right. People like Smith and John Stuart Mill, they used to use phrases like commercial society. And they used to talk about markets. They didn't actually talk about free markets. And that's an important point too. But yeah, the origins of the defense of capitalism were very much grounded, or capitalism as we would now call it, very much grounded in concerns about feudalism and the history of economic orders, rather than contemporary or 20th century socialism. That's an important point to emphasize. But as I said, the book sort of evolved out of the course, right? And so I did just give students these primary sources, but it's fair to say that these are fairly heavy-going texts. John Stuart Mill's Principles of Political Economy, it's about 800 pages. It's got these huge digressions on the price of wool in 19th century Lancashire. It's kind of interesting, but it's not really getting to the...
Smith does a bit of that
Oh
too.
yeah, there's a long digression on silver early in the book. And look, it's not as if they're not worth reading, but students got other things to do with their lives. They've at least got other subjects they've got to write essays for. So the point of a textbook is to be a kind of gateway drug, if I can use that phrase.
Yeah, sure.
The hard stuff is the primary text, and we hope that students, or readers will go on and look at them. But anyway, in the early days, I was giving folks these primary texts, and people were, the average student, and I don't mean that not in a disrespectful way, the average student who's got a lot of things going on in their life, which is fair enough, was sort of struggling a bit to get through this. So I was writing these long handouts, which I'd give out once per lecture, and these handouts were getting to be sort of 4 or 5 pages long. And it just occurred to me that, look, this is all, I've got enough the handout material has now grown large enough that you could sort of staple it all together and call it a book. So I thought, well, maybe that's actually what should be done. There wasn't a textbook out there because I'd looked for it. It wasn't one that really suited my ambitions for the class. So I thought, well, why not give it a crack and write something? And I thought, well, look, I can't really do this on my own, really, because I don't really know enough. I mean, the class at the time was sort of fine for a one-off class at Melbourne Uni, but to get a textbook that would work for lots of different classes at lots of places, which of course is what you need to do to get a marketable textbook, I wanted a bit more expertise on it. So I went to see John Thrasher, he was working at Monash at the time. He's since gone back to America, but he was working at Monash. He's got a different background from me. He knows a bit more economics for sure. I said, look, John, do you want to have a crack at this? I mean, I've already put in some of the mileage with this class. And he just said, yeah, let's have a go. So that was it. We just sort of got on with it, and wrote most of the book in a relatively short period. Wrote most of the book in about a period of a few months, and I think would have been 2017. For one semester, I was sort of getting up at 5 a.m, driving into the office, doing 2 or 3 hours of work on the textbook, and then sort of going into the normal work day. So we banged out a draft pretty quickly, and then it was just, as is the case with academic publishing, it was then a few more years of refinements, referee reports, sharing it around some of our friends and colleagues. But yeah, the book occurred because I tried to teach without a textbook and decided one was needed, and that I was sort of writing one by accident with these handouts. So I never would have planned to write a textbook. In fact, it's a little bit narcissistic when to think that, oh, I'm going to write the book that the student,
right? Yeah.
It's normally something that people do later in their careers. But in the end, I guess the market had a gap in it, and the market finds a way.
Well, that's it. I'd like to get to that too. So, I mean, because, talking of, how ambitious people were, I mean, Hayek sort of brought a little bit more ambition into it again, right?
Hayek, yeah, he's an interesting guy. I see Hayek as a sort of descendant of Smith, trying to bring a bit more systematicity and precision to Smith's work. So Smith's famous for talking about the invisible hand. I don't like metaphors very much because, well, from a philosophical point of view, metaphors are problematic because they're never true, right? And there is no hand, invisible or otherwise.
Right.
So Smith said, oh, there's this invisible hand driving the markets or driving prosperity. And that's been influential, and there was some truth in it, but it was really Hayek who began to put together something less metaphorical when he talked about spontaneous order, right? And the idea that, look, markets are, he thought markets are superior to governments when it comes to producing a wide variety of goods and services, because while on the one hand, governments need to sort of centralize all the information and sort of plan things from the top down, markets allow no one knows everything, but everyone knows something, and everyone just kind of responds to their local facts about supply and demand, and it's the price system that moves the information around. And it's almost a bit like a language. No one really invented the English language or any other language. It is still a product of human action. It does still, but it sort of solves problems of cooperation without anyone being in control. And frankly, there would be no point you wouldn't improve it by trying to take control of it. Now, Hayek thought, or can be read as thinking, that markets are a little bit like that. And that's the invisible hand thing. It's the idea that there's order, people are responding, people are following rules, but there's no one sort of in control. And that's more satisfying. It's less metaphorical. Doesn't mean it's completely right. I mean, there's all sorts of differences between markets and natural languages, and that's something we talk about at some length.
Right.
But it's progress.
Yeah. I think it is very fair to his characterization of it and to describe it as a kind of collective intelligence. Yeah.
Yes, I think that's how he would. That would be I mean, Hayek went on to say some more controversial things later in his career. I mean, all this stuff about spontaneous order was actually quite earlier in his career. I don't like his later career work much.
Right.
I don't know if Thrasher would agree with that, but it's really that one paper from the 1940s about the use of knowledge in society. That really makes this point quite well and quite quickly, and in ways that are quite accessible really to students.
Yeah. So something that I see coming up again and again is this idea of well, there are a lot of sort of confusing things. The terms get used by everybody in different ways. I mean, some of the most abused words, I think, or perhaps if you're a linguist, you might like the fact that, they have so many different meanings attached to them. I'm not sure. But, you tried to clarify this with this logical space of a triangle. And I might try and, link to an image of that in the description of the podcast.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about the triangle?
Yeah, so why are we talking about triangles in the first place? Well, triangles are two-dimensional shapes. And the point of a two-dimensional shape is to get away from the one-dimensional thinking of, well, capitalism and socialism as being the kind of exhaustive of the options, right? And that's very much parallel to thinking in terms of left wing and right wing. We're always hearing talk about the left and the right and capitalism and socialism, and we wanted to really discourage this in the book because it really oversimplifies things in it.
Right, yeah, it's horribly reductive to everybody involved.
Well, it just confuses. I mean, at the very least, it obscures certain possibilities. So the triangle is a way of mapping out logical space. By logical space, we just mean the range of logically possible arrangements when it comes to economic systems. The triangle is a way of emphasizing that, look, there's really three extremes. Instead of that, on the line, there's two extremes, capitalism and socialism, on the one-dimensional picture. But we think there's capitalism, socialism, and feudalism, right? And you can sort of, these are the 3 points of the triangle, yeah? And you can sort of conceptualize the range of possibilities in terms of, the actual socio-economic status quo, right? The way things actually are in some country or region at some time is some kind of hodgepodge of, or is very often some kind of hodgepodge of feudalism, socialist and capitalist elements, right? Now it might tend towards one of the corners. In fact, you look at medieval Europe, it was feudalist.
Yeah.
There was a little bit of capitalism going on insofar as there was some effort to promote markets, but it was feudalist. You look at Soviet Russia, well, you're going to call it socialist because the state controlled the economy. Doesn't mean that it was actually proponents of socialism are going to argue that wasn't the idea. Well, Karl Marx wasn't really trying to persuade us to adopt Stalinist Russia, and that's absolutely right. But that's further reason to recognize a deeper point here, which is that the way things are, or what we might call the socio-economic status quo, isn't usually just one system. It isn't just some carefully crafted system that is compliant with just one of these sort of idealizations. So a very closely connected point, and which is one of the more central points of the book, at least early on, is that there's a tendency for us to use the word capitalism just to refer to the status quo. At least in countries like Australia, those in Western Europe, North America, Japan, South Korea, we all think of these as capitalist countries. But they're all kind of different from each other. They really are. And they've all got rather different histories from each other. And a lot of the economic status quo is a hangover from the past. Now, on reflection, this shouldn't really be that controversial, But But nonetheless, we tend to just say, oh, capitalism is running things in these countries, or these countries are capitalist, without pausing to reflect and think about, well, hang on a minute, might these countries differ insofar as they're actually different combinations, even if they sort of lean towards the capitalist extreme. Is it really so? Is it really right to say they are just capitalist? And the book, and this is one area where the book does actually come down with a quite explicit opinion, is that no, we shouldn't. They really are a bit of a mixture. Um, the UK, where I'm from, big feudal history there. I mean, you still got a hereditary monarchy which owns a chunk of the land.
Right, and the House of Lords, is that still? Do you still have to be a lord to?
You have to be a lord to be in it, but you don't have to be born, you don't have
Yeah.
to be born a lord anymore. Well, you never did. You'd always get
Okay.
made. I mean, the lords
Right.
somewhere. Yeah, the hereditary peerage system, as it was called, got wound down in the 1990s. It was one of the more controversial. Well, it was one of the sort of the flagship policies of Tony Blair's uh, period as prime minister. But it's still unelected. So, I mean, the Lords works a little bit like the Senate in Australia, or indeed the Senate in the USA, where it's a sort of upper chamber, and the lower house puts up legislation and the upper house kind of does stuff to it and sometimes rejects it. But in Britain, it's unelected. It's still, it's not, membership is no longer primarily hereditary. You sort of get into it. Well, it's unclear how you get into it. Officially, you get into it by having, performed a life of public service such that you're selected, but there's always question marks about who gets in there. But in a way, if you want to see legacies of feudalism, that there's some much more straightforward examples of that. Things like inherited wealth.
So yeah, I want to talk to you about this as well, because Google has told me that you had a book on inherited wealth not too long before this book came out. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Google's right about that. Yes, I did write a book about inheritance a couple of years. Well, I think it came out in 2018. Again, it took a few years to write, such as the nature of the process.
Was that your gateway drug into this area a little bit?
I'm not sure. I mean, inheritance does come up in the Ethics of Capitalism, right? I mean, and it's interesting because inheritance is something that influences the distribution of wealth, but it's not part of the market. It's got nothing really to do with. It's outside of the market. It's not like the distribution of income or how much stuff costs. It's just wealth moving around in this sort of asymmetric parent to child or parent to other kind of friend or relative. And one way in which it is a gateway, I suppose, is that, look, we all think that inheritance has some significance when it comes to distributive justice, and that we all agree. I think there's a serious question about how fair is inheritance. Whatever our actual answer to that question is, it's a serious question. But if you think that inheritance or the unequal distribution of inheritance is unjust, it's very strange to blame that on capitalism, because it's got nothing to do with markets. But it's actually a big parallel with feudalism in medieval Europe, because that feudalism was a system in which inheritance basically settled the question of how you were going to get on in life.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest critiques today is that it still does, because of things like private schools and sort of other institutions that have maybe starting to look a little bit more feudal in recent years than they did before.
Yeah.
So this might be a good way to transition into talking about positional goods or private education or something along those lines. What do you think? Which direction do you think we should head in?
Yeah, well, I'll say a few words about private education. Is a tricky one. Well, first of all, private education is the sale of educational resources in the market, broadly speaking. So it is part of the market, and this is tricky because in a country like Britain, where I'm from, there aren't many private schools. So they account for a much smaller fraction of the the population who's privately educated is smaller than in Australia. Put it that way. So for that reason alone, there's a bit more of a tendency of private education to be the sort of domain of the real elite in Britain. Plus I mean, Australia is a very old country, but with regard to the settler community here, it's been around less long than the British community. So private education, how we think of it in terms of perpetuating things like class hierarchy, is going to depend on the specifics of the country. one thing you might say about private education in Australia is, well, it's a way for immigrants to sort of catch up, right? I mean, this is an argument that might actually be, I'm not saying it's right, but one argument you might make about Australia is that, look, if someone migrates here and they don't own property, they're not going to inherit anything, putting their kid through private education might seem to them like a way of, giving their kid something comparable to what the kids who are already here have got in terms of, inheriting a house in, an inner Melbourne or an inner Sydney suburb. So it's actually what we say about private education in isolation. Well, it's hard to say something in isolation from the specifics of the socioeconomic status quo. That's just a kind of, qualification. Nonetheless, there is this influential argument that we discuss in the book, and which is quite popular among political philosophers, that private education is unjust to the extent that you are purchasing advantage for your kid over other kids whose parents don't have that kind of resource, who aren't in a position to pay for private school. And that's not fair. It's not fair that, what that educational advantage, which should be distributed meritocratically, is distributed instead by the market. Right? So one view is that markets shouldn't be the mechanism through which those goods are pursued. And you asked about the positional good. Well, the idea of a positional good is really just embedded in what I said, which is that you've got a positional good when, the value of your share is dependent on what other people's shares are like, right? So the value of the food in my fridge, in terms of the benefit it gives to me, it doesn't really matter what's in other people's fridges. Okay, my orange juice is tasty regardless of what anyone else has got in terms of orange juice or any other kind of food. How good are my high school grades or my degree classification or whatnot, educational credentials? Well, that really does depend on what position they give me in the ranking of my peer group.
Yeah.
Hence positional good, right? It's good for you insofar as it gives you better position. And a lot of goods are like that. Education isn't the only one, but education's a pretty important one, because the quality of your education in terms of the position you get in the ranking is going to affect things like access to university, and it's going to affect things like how competitive you are in the labour market. And for most of us, those are really, really crucial things. And you might think it's not fair that, how wealthy your parents are should have any real bearing on your chances of getting a good position in the ranking. That's the influential argument, but it is complicated.
Yeah. Okay, so this is sort of do you think that private property, as we conceive of it, in the current context and the status quo, is also to some extent, a hangover from feudalism?
That's a great question. So feudalism is unlike socialism in that property is privately held, right? Under socialism, the idea is property, or at least productive property, things like factories and industries, is state-owned and controlled by the state. Is private property what I think capitalism, or at least the early era defense of market society, like Adam Smith. The objection wasn't really to private property being a thing in feudalism. The objection was to it being concentrated, so that all of the assets, the land and the industry. There wasn't much industry then, but all of the productive assets, the assets that can sort of generate an income, are owned by a tiny elite: the monarchy, the nobility, maybe the church. And so people like Smith wanted to see land ownership disperse, right, so that everyone, or most people could own enough land so that they could generate their own income off it. So really, he was about emancipating the peasants. The peasants who work the land shouldn't be under the control of the landowner or the aristocrat. They should own their own land, or if they don't own it, they should at least be entitled to its output. So that's a pre-industrial view, right? That's a view that's been formulated when land ownership really was, when land was the primary asset. The industrial.
Yeah, I've heard something similar from, Locke. I think that the idea is that if you're working on the land, you should own it, and therefore you have an incentive to improve it. Also,
there are parallels there. Locke's even older than Smith, so again, pre-industrial. Locke's views are a lot less elaborate than Smith's. I would say we don't actually teach we don't put a whole lot of Locke in the book, really. Also, there's also a bit of a problem about there's a nasty history of Locke's views being used to justify colonial acquisition. And
Yep.
it's not entirely clear whether his views are being misappropriated there or just properly applied. Although
Okay.
I will say for Smith, it's actually very hard. Smith was a real opponent of colonialism,
Yeah.
very,
Yeah.
very effective opponent. And it's very, very hard to find, a racist remark in his writings, which is really saying something for an 18th century. Well, he wasn't English; he was Scottish, and perhaps makes a difference. But it's one reason we like to teach him is although he was defending markets, he was defending markets as an alternative.
On moral
Yeah, and as
grounds.
an alternative to the colonialism as he knew it at the time, and he lived a little bit before the British Empire really reached its peak. But people were certainly, you know, helping them, settlers or colonialists were certainly helping themselves forcibly to land in Australia and North America and elsewhere at the time of his writing. I'm digressing a little bit now. You were asking about private property.
Private property.
So for Smith, and arguably for any inheritor of his views, private property is a good thing if it's spread around, right? Because it gives you a bit of independence. Most of us, owning your own home, and this is going to be controversial, but a lot of us feel in Australia and elsewhere that owning your own home is a good thing if you can get it. And it does protect you against a lot. If you're renting a home the whole time, you're vulnerable to being turfed out, or being kicked out. You don't have control over just the sheer infrastructure. You get permission before you do anything to the property. So you might think that just ownership is a good thing for the average person when it comes to assets like land and housing. There's a further question though about when we say private property, do we really care about productive property or unproductive property? Now, houses are sort of unproductive in the sense that they don't generate an output. Okay, you can argue that they're productive insofar as they allow someone to live there who can then go and do some work, right? But they don't.
Right, and raise children, and
ultimately they are productive in a kind of roundabout way, but they don't generate any. They don't. But living in a house is not like owning a factory or a business where the purpose of that entity is to generate a return, or if not the purpose, one of the primary features of it. Of course, you can own a home and rent it out to someone else, and we can get into we can and should get into a debate, especially in Australia, about how that's being managed. But is private property a bad thing? Well, Smith is going to say no, it's a good thing, but it has to be dispersed. If it's not dispersed, if it's concentrated in as per feudalism, you're going to get status hierarchy, domination, all kinds of unpleasant stuff, and actually not a lot of production. So that's the sort of answer that I think that's still quite a good answer to the question of how should we feel broadly about private property. There's room for lots of disagreement and further reflection on more specific questions, that come up with regard to particular types of property or particular types of assets.
Yeah. Okay. So on this vein a little bit, maybe it'd be good to talk about, some of the reasons why private property seems to be concentrated in our system a little bit more than, Smith might have envisioned, right? So, we have these massive corporations that, they are probably, relative to maybe, during his time, the British East India Company, that they're probably small as a percentage of GDP still, but they are quite large, right? And they're not like the pin factory that he imagines in the division of labor.
Yeah.
So what economic forces are driving the reality of large companies? So
Great. Well, you sort of half answered the question in a way. I mean, it's a great question. What Adam Smith didn't see coming was the Industrial Revolution. It only really got going just after his book, The Wealth of Nations, that is, appeared in the 1770s. And one thing the Industrial Revolution taught us is that there's a tendency for large hierarchical firms to persist. And Smith thought this wouldn't happen because Smith thought, who really wants to work for a firm and be bossed around when you could work for yourself? Right? I mean, working for a firm, he thought, well, that's a bit like being a peasant. It's not as bad, but it's being in a hierarchy and, being told what to do and not owning straightforwardly all of the output of the product and of the process. And of course, Karl Marx kind of went with that. Karl Marx, by the way, really quite a descendant of Smith in lots of ways. Okay, just updating the perspective because the Industrial Revolution has happened by the time Karl Marx is writing, and he's able to, work that into his reflections on capitalism. But yeah, one thing that happened that wasn't anticipated was this tendency of big firms to dominate, or if not dominate, at least in certain industries, for big firms to be the norm. It's actually, the restaurant industry isn't really like the groceries industry. It does depend a little bit on what's being produced and whether the economies of scale, whether production is really subject to economies of scale, which will work in favour of big firms, and actually, frankly, whether production is intimately related to large hierarchies and people bossing other people around. And then there's just some goods and services that just don't, like a university. University is still a firm. Okay, a firm is just any employer. The Catholic Church is a firm, right? Things like universities and churches, they sort of make more sense when they're big. I mean, you can't set up a university like a milk bar on the, legally you could, right? You could get the right to issue degrees if you tried hard enough, but it wouldn't really be a university as we know it. Some services are sort of consumed in such a way that there's lots of people giving you lots of different things you want, and there's lots of other consumers with whom you're sort of sharing the consumption. Anyway, long story short, this was not anticipated. This became clear as the Industrial Revolution took hold, but it wasn't anticipated. And I think one of the theoretical upshots of this is that we need to temper, if not, we need to revisit some of Smith's optimism about markets, because he thought markets were going to, turn society from a nation of peasants into, well, the phrase is a nation of shopkeepers, or a nation of self-employed individuals, and they didn't do that. Labour markets didn't work that way, and a lot of jobs in firms are less desirable. There's room for a debate about this. I mean, not everyone wants to be a shopkeeper in the first place. No one wants to be a peasant, and not everyone wants to be a shopkeeper either. So there's room for a debate about how bad it is for people to be working in firms. But when firms are not so bad, that's usually partly because of the labour law has made sure that they're not nasty places to work, which they largely were in the 19th century when Marx and Mill were writing. So I think that the big thing is that hierarchical firms were not anticipated.
And so this leads into Coates and transactions costs, and natural monopolies, I guess.
So what?
And I'd say in sort of more recent history with the big tech platforms, it's like, it's network effects. And, once you have a certain number of people, you attract even more people. And it's very hard to, start a competitor because, nobody's on that other platform. So that's enough. I think those are maybe three different ways that, we're driving towards large entities. What do you think about those?
Large in a sense, and large in probably a problematic way. But it is worth emphasizing that, the enthusiasm that some people have for things like, well, they call it platform capitalism. Might hesitate a bit before we use that word, but the enthusiasm that people have is partly Smithian in nature, right? Because the thought goes that these these tech firms, they're firms, but a lot of people sell their labor through them on what is supposed to be a freelance basis. Now that is very much up for debate whether that's what's going on, but there's a big difference nonetheless between selling your labor through some sort of digital platform and working for an old-fashioned, pre-internet, if you like, firm. There is a bit of a difference in terms of the hierarchy. It's still big, as you emphasized. And, the digital economy is still subject to economies of scale, right, or network effects, whereby, you need a critical mass of participants before you're really competing, before you really, got staying power. But they're not really like workplaces either. So there's this debate now about, well, when is someone working for a firm such that they're employed, and when are they merely just dealing with a firm? So if I'm a freelance plumber, I might go and fix the pipes in a firm. I might go and fix the pipes in a hotel or something. Doesn't mean I work for that hotel. I mean, in the sense I work for that hotel, I sell my labor to that hotel, but I'm not an employee of that hotel. I'm a freelancer, and that's why the hotel can't just sort of boss me around. They can say, look, do this and we'll pay you, but they can't order me around, and they might order, some of their own staff. But the lines about this have been really blurred by these digital platforms. And this one of the interesting debates that we need to have in the 21st century, that again was not anticipated, or even in the 20th century, is, you know, what is the concept of employment? Where do we draw the line between someone who's working for themselves and someone who's working for someone else? And in drawing that line, what kind of difference is it going to make to people's entitlements? And what kind of injustice is being done if we draw the line in the wrong place? And these are all questions that we're yet to properly answer in Australia and elsewhere.
Yeah. Because if we don't do them quite right, then there's going to be room to exploit the margins there.
Well, what we need is a sort of theory of, you know, what we try and do in political economy is come up with a theory of justice for the market. I mean, the market is not quite what people have expected it to be in the past. And what the evolution of the market has been driven partly by how we've chosen to regulate it. You know, people like Adam Smith were really optimistic, but, you know, that optimism was to some degree misplaced, and as a result calls for some kind of regulation. Markets are going to create winners and losers at the best of times, but they're going to be subject to these kinds of, you know, perversities or questions about, well, what's really going on here. And a lot of the substance of this book, you know, the Ethics of Capitalism, is about working out, well, what do we actually do when we're confronted with these actual realities? What kind of theory can we draw on that will tell us how to make, you know, how to regulate the market so that we do harness its productive potential, and in some cases its emancipatory potential, without drifting back into something like feudalism, where there's, you know, hierarchy and domination and lack of opportunity for people to get ahead.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that, you know, we've talked about some of the problems that you know, are present in the status quo, and maybe it might be good to just lay one more thing out. So, there's something that interesting that certain different people have identified, which is that something, you know, went on from the end of the Second World War until about the early 70s. That was, you know, it was this massive explosion in prosperity, and coinciding with that was, you know, also a decline in wealth inequality. And then something seems to go wrong, you know, in the early 70s, and growth slows down, and inequality, at least in the West, starts to increase. And, you know, there are some things that I think about with this. So, you know, during the 20th century, you have massive technological progress in sort of the first half, and it's very obvious. You know, you have the widespread adoption of cars, electric appliances, you know, plastics, you know, planes, and then, you know, after the 70s onwards, you sort of have incremental improvements to those technologies, but the only really new technology after that is, you know, computers, it seems like, and variations on that theme. And so I was wondering, you know, do you have any ideas around what went wrong in the early 70s? Have we stagnated, you know, intellectually in some kind of fashion?
Yeah, that's a good point. And yeah, people do make this observation quite often, that things seem to slow down since, well, between 1945 and 1970, there was this, well, at least between 1960 and 1970, things were pretty good. There's a bit of variation from country to country. But yes, wage stagnation, as it's often called, has become fairly normal. And it's come to Australia as well, although a little bit later than some of the other countries that you might have in mind. What went wrong? I don't really have. I mean, the only answer I'd give is the one I've picked up from others, which is that, well, you know, wage growth slowed. It's unclear what caused it to slow, but, you know, willingness to tax wealth, inheritance, and so on, perhaps made it the case that, you know, people are going to invest in things like houses so they can extract wealth from renters, perhaps more than in companies. I'm really sort of making this up as I go along. But in a way, the philosophical question might be, well, what was it that went wrong? Was it the slowdown, or was it how we responded to the slowdown? Okay. John Stuart Mill's got this nice little chapter in his Principles of Political Economy on the stationary state. Okay. And the idea here is roughly like this. Why do we care about economic growth? Well, we tend to care about it because we think it's linked to wage growth and low unemployment, which, in large part it is.
And maybe technological progress,
Yes.
and perhaps we've tied it into the idea of progress.
Yes, I suppose we have. And it's also true, as you noted, that, while there were all these technological developments in the sort of early to mid 20th century, since 1970s, we've had computer development. We've also had a bit in pharmaceuticals. And in fact, right now, as we're talking, we're hoping that they're getting closer to this COVID vaccine. And, that sort of stuff, cancer treatment, for example, has really come along.
It is worth saying biology and computer science are really the ones that have been chugging forward. I think. But outside of that, it's less easy to identify.
But the thought in John Stuart Mill was that, well, we don't. Why do we care about growth? Because we care about jobs and incomes. But aren't we? Mill thought that we're going to reach a stage, or market economies are going to reach a stage where they've kind of produced most of the stuff they've got to produce. Everyone's got enough to eat. I'm not saying everyone has, in fact, got enough to eat, but look, things are a lot better than they were when he was writing in the 19th century. And the thought might be, we'll reach a stage where low growth isn't such a bad thing because we can all just stop working as much. Maybe the people who are, got all the ideas in tech and in pharmaceuticals can keep going. But maybe when we've got slow economic growth, that's just a sign that we've picked all the low-hanging fruit. And now we should just enjoy the possibility of taking our foot off the gas and having more leisure time. That's actually what he said. Now, why has that not happened? Well, the reason it's not happened isn't that not enough wealth has been produced. It's that your way of getting a share of it is still through the labour market. Okay? So people still have to... There's a lot of wealth in society, at least in Australia. There's a lot of wealth here. There's plenty of food. There's plenty of housing. Okay, there's enough cars. Hopefully soon there's going to be enough corona vaccine. There's a lot of stuff compared to the 19th century when markets were seen as this way of getting people out of abject poverty. The problem with Australia is more about distribution than production. And Mill said this. He said, look, there's a distinction between production problems and distribution problems. And we might reach a stage where we're going to solve the production problem before the distribution one. The distribution one's going to linger because we can produce enough stuff, and then we've got to find a way of sharing it out. But if everyone gets their share by selling labour, it's almost as if we're pretending we've still got to solve the production problem.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting, and it sort of ties into this, the Keynes prediction of the 15-hour work week.
Yeah,
that
very similar. Very similar. And the reason we haven't got a 15-hour work week is because the regulation of the economy still basically says if you don't have independent wealth, if you don't inherit something, you only get money if you work for it. So proponents of schemes like basic income are actually can be, there's lots of different ways of coming at these proposals and trying to defend them. But one way of defending them is actually to make this million point, to say that, look, there's enough to go around now. Not everyone has to work the whole time. Those who want to can, and perhaps there should still be some incentive, right, to get people to do the certain kinds of work that still have this important payoff, like vaccine research. But look, you don't have. There's enough to go around. Let's just let everyone have some share of the wealth that's enough to keep you going, and not require them to work. But we haven't done that. We're sort of doing it a little bit under the pandemic, right, with the JobKeeper scheme in Australia, and which is a bit like basic income. It's not quite basic income because not everyone gets it.
Although the people who are on unemployment, a lot of them are getting extra supplements as well. So it will be an interesting case study to see what has gone on during this period.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously people, like the whole point is that people can't work, but it'll be interesting to see, well, what have people been doing at home during this period? And
how will it have changed attitudes, right? Both among citizens or participants in the economy and indeed politicians. But I think the big theoretical point I want to emphasize is that the slowdown is only bad if you need to work to get enough to live on, right? The slowdown needn't be, if you've got a lot of wealth and it's growing slowly, you wouldn't necessarily care, right? I mean,
right.
It's accessing it that's the problem. So all this talk of the slowdown and wage stagnation is very much presupposing that we need to keep economic growth going and we need to get our share of wealth, most of us, by working. And it's not clear that those more suppressed premises are are correct. And the defence of basic income is starting to invoke this angle a bit more. And who knows? Maybe we'll come out of the whole pandemic thing saying, yeah, maybe the time's come in Australia to just share the wealth a bit and not worry too much about growth, because we worry about growth because we worry about jobs and unemployment. But if we've got off that, if we've stopped requiring that everyone does that, which is what the welfare state does, you've got to prove you're trying to find work the whole time just to get, continued payments. If we can get off that, we'll have a very different attitude towards slow growth and stagnation. There'll still be the point about, we still want these frontiers of technology to progress. But frankly, trying to get everyone into work, any kind of work at all, isn't really what's going to make the difference to whether we get a corona vaccine. Pushing everyone to work in fast food restaurants or whatever it might be that, the unemployed are being made to do is not going to have that effect.
So what do you think about the bullshit jobs?
Yeah.
Hypothesis or theory, I guess.
Or maybe it's just a fact. This is actually related to this what's sometimes called the fetishism of work, right? The idea that everyone should have a job. So you're talking about the David Graeber thing, which is based on a sort of study he did where he got people to literally just email him if they hated their job and tell him why they hated it. And of course, this raises the question about you never heard from the people who did like their job, which there might be quite a few. But yeah, it's a thing. The idea of bullshit jobs, well, it's actually a bunch of different things at once, right? You've got a bullshit job if it satisfies at least one of several criteria of sort of bullshitness, right? But it's to do with having a sort of white collar job that's a bit pointless, right? That's just sort of going through the motions of something to make yourself look productive, or to make your superior look productive or important, or to kind of fix, make little running repairs on a system that could just be designed better in the first place. So I know higher education better than any other job, but there'll be some software that's 20 years old and it keeps breaking down, and I have to keep emailing some person to go in and fix it. And this poor person, that's just sort of all they're doing, going in and fixing this system that could just be kind of redesigned in ways that didn't have this problem. And that's very, very, David Graeber things is very, very demeaning. Well, not demeaning, he calls it psychologically violent, I think is the phrase he uses. And there are parallels here with Karl Marx, right? Because Marx was all about,
this is about the alienation.
Absolutely,
point.
Alienated labour, which again in Marx is more than one thing, right? But the idea that, to quote directly, the idea that the worker is a mere appendage of the machine, right? The idea that you're just sort of going through these motions because you're a cog in the machine, almost literally. Although that's another metaphor, but the idea is that you as an individual are not really producing anything meaningful. Now, for Marx, that wasn't because there was no production. It's just because the machine is such that your role in it is the same as any other worker who got plugged in, right? It's a comment on industrial revolution style production line labor, right? Where you just stand on a product, maybe you help make cars and you just drill one wing mirror into every car that comes past. That's all you ever. Right? It's very productive. It's just unpleasant. The flip in Graeber's thing is that it's not even productive now, really. It's just kind of going through the motions to make it look like something's been done when sort of either nothing's been done, or what's been done didn't need to get done, or could have got done more efficiently if someone just took the trouble to redesign it.
Yeah, and I think that this is interesting because in this later period, from the 70s onward, you could argue we've seen a big blow up in certain areas. There seems to be a lot more administrators in a lot more places than there were before. And the financial sector is seemingly much larger than it was before, from what I understand. I could be wrong about that. I don't have the numbers on it, but those are the kinds of jobs where you could imagine people being given sort of menial tasks that aren't really doing much of anything. They just sort of look like they're doing something.
Yeah, well, Graeber's got this idea about I think he calls it corporate. If he doesn't call it corporate feudalism, other people do, right? And the idea, so under original feudalism, you had a sort of social, the monarchs and the nobles, and they wanted to surround themselves with sort of, garishly dressed servants and armies, and wanted to have a lot of people under them to look good. And that's sort of how they compared. That's how they competed with each other for status. In fact, Adam Smith talks about this. He talks about this is why we should tax luxury goods, because they're just this pointless positional good, this competition amongst the wealthy to look better, so we should tax that. But Graeber and others think that, look, the modern, the contemporary sort of senior executive wants to, that they sort of rate their status. I'm not saying this is true, by the way, but this is the hypothesis, is that they all rate their status according to how many underlings they have, for want of a better way of putting it. And the top CEO does that, but so does the person underneath them, because they've got underlings too, right? And everyone just wants to have more and more underlings, so they create more jobs for the sake of having someone underneath them. But of course, that means the job probably doesn't need to exist. Hence, they have to concoct some kind of process to make it look like it's important. Hence, it's a bullshit job, right? Where someone's just kind of, constantly revising some document, or sending out emails that don't need to get sent, and all that kind of stuff. So that's one explanation for why there's been this rise in sort of white collar, relatively low level administration. I should say, just to bring a bit of balance to this, that there's room for pushback against this. I mean, a lot of institutions now have just got to respond to more regulation than they used to, right? I mean, which is in some ways a good thing. In the 60s and 70s, for example, not a lot of attention was being paid to, was there much workplace bullying? Was there child abuse in children's homes? All this kind of stuff. And it may be that now we're just getting a little bit more careful about keeping an eye on the well-being of vulnerable people, and that's going to create, that's going to involve administration, right? So the university takes very seriously, Melbourne University, and indeed other universities take more seriously than they used to, student well-being and the position of vulnerable students. And that's arguably something that they really should have been doing for a long time. But because they've only started doing it recently, there's been more administration created as a result. So we just want to be a little bit careful. It might still be true, right, that the senior people want to have underlings, but sometimes that can coincide with something good, or maybe that's not even what they want. Maybe they just actually, the senior people just want to take care of some of these things in ways that they didn't used to. So there's room for a bit of back and forth on this. But it is alienated labor 21st century style, that's for sure. When bullshit jobs occur, that's kind of what they are. The Graeber things are kind of a Marxist thing updated for the nature of white collar, sat at a computer screen kind of work.
Yeah. Yep. Looping back around to the 60s point again, what do you think happened in that post-war period? If we flip it around and we say, instead of looking at, what happened afterwards as the outlier, given that, sort of before and after look more similar than different in a lot of ways, what was unique about that period? Wealth inequality has been the norm throughout human history.
Yeah, well, the Thomas Piketty line from a few years ago is that wealth inequality was always there, but when wages were growing, people could catch up a bit with the people who just had the wealth. And when wages stagnate, having the wealth, being born with wealth is more important than it used to be, because if you're not, there's not so much you can do in the labour market to catch up. And again, that invites parallels with feudalism. What went wrong? Well, again, this is a really, really big question. Or what went wrong? What changed? There's a few factors that in my mind are quite important. And one is just the tendency for labour markets to go more towards this sort of winner takes all structure. Okay, whereby to take the entertainment industry, you go back to the 40s and the 50s, there's still loads of people going to theatres who didn't own TV. And there's an example in the book we use about stand-up comedians in the UK, and probably in most countries. They just go around telling the same jokes at a different theatre for years. I mean, that's alienated labour, right, for a start. But it was something they could do, and lots of them could do it, because there are so many theatres in the country, and each comedian could sort of take their turn. But once you've got TV, that's not the case. You're going to get some very small number of very good comedians who can keep thinking of new jokes, like every week or whatever, and they're going to hoover up all the market share. Similarly for professional sports, right? Sports like soccer, they were globally popular in the 50s and 60s, or at least they were popular in Europe and Latin America. And hundreds of thousands of people would go down to the stadium to watch. But once there's TV, that same number of people, let's say, are watching fewer games. And so you don't need as many top footballers. And because the advertising industries, started interacting with television, the money going to those players is immense. And that's why the top athletes, at least in sports like soccer with big television audiences, earn staggering amounts, when the
Yeah.
top footballers in the 50s and 60s earn probably about the same as a university lecturer.
Hmm.
Fancy that. Um,
Yeah.
so there's those kinds of factors, right? There's ways in which labour markets have become more polarised, such that there are new elite professions where massive salaries exist which didn't before, but an ebbing away of the kind of middle ground, perhaps. And this is what some people predict. They think that automation is going to destroy skilled work. This is a little different thing from the polar. This is a different thing from the audience concentration effect. This is a different thing from what television did. But there's a thought that automation is going to take away skilled work and either make people unemployed or doing menial work for very little money, whilst creating a kind of elite of people who can kind of enhance what the machines do. So a bit like
Yeah.
pilots and surgeons who all work with machines, very sophisticated machines, but who enhance what the machines can do. Or in some cases, the machines can't do it on their own. It takes a small number of very skilled people to do that. So that's maybe one factor, has been the role of automation in sort of hollowing out some of the kind of middle ground of the labour market. But then again, it's not obvious that that's right. I mean, automation. David Ricardo had it right back in the the 19th century, that automation will destroy jobs, but it will also create jobs. And most of the well-paying jobs now actually depend, as I've said, they do actually depend on machines.
So the sort of there is an opposite side of the argument to the sort of the more pessimistic Piketty argument, which is, say, like the Steven Pinker argument, okay, which is, wealth inequality from the sort of the 70s onwards, it's been increasing, but within Western countries, but globally it's been decreasing. And really what's going on here is that, the markets are just distributing the wealth equitably across the globe because of globalization. And so really, there's nothing to see here. There's nothing really to be concerned about. Neoliberalism's doing just fine. And, we're really at the high watermark of human civilization, and the water's still going up, and maybe also we're not thinking about how great technology is. Maybe technology isn't obviously just like a car. It's just so much better than a car or a plane or an regular electric appliance. You can get so much out of it. You can teach yourself on it. You can get levels of entertainment on it that were never possible before. You can do all the old things like reading books, but you can also play video games. You can watch television shows. It's enabling whole new forms of doing art and other things. How do you respond to that? That seems to me to be partly correct, but not. It seems to miss something.
Right. Well, the globalization thing, for example, there's some truth. Wealth inequality globally, whatever the state of wealth inequality, there's plenty of people in developing countries, particularly places like China, who are wealthier than they used to be, at least according to conventional metrics. Which will leave some things out, like the effects of pollution. And in some respects, the Western countries, for want of a better word, they just had to give up a bit of their privilege. In terms of not being the only developed countries anymore. Unfortunately, that the giving up of the privilege has really sort of fallen on the sort of middle and lower and working classes rather than on the elites. But nonetheless, if you take a sort of global view, it's not obvious that you can really be too unhappy about people coming out of poverty in very large numbers in places like China and to some extent India. And you also mentioned that a lot of stuff has got cheaper than it used to and easier to access. So, when I'm talking to students, I give the example of, CDs, right? If you want, when I was a teenager and you wanted to listen to some music, you had to go out and pay, well, it would have been about £14. I mean, in today's money, in Australian dollars, it would have been quite a lot just to get 10 songs on a CD. But now you just go online and it's free. It's or it's almost free.
Yeah, it's like, for students, Spotify's like $6 a
Yeah, it's
month.
ridiculous compared to how I had it. Oh my god! And and you go back further. I mean, you go back far enough. If you want to listen to music, you had to pay someone to play it, and they probably weren't very good. I mean, again, this winner takes all market. We've now all got access to the best musicians, whereas before recording technology, you just had to go and find whoever could.
Yeah, you go to a local jazz bar or
Yeah,
something.
if that. And so stuff is, there does seem to be this enduring tendency for high quality stuff just to get cheaper, depending on the industry, of course. I mean, entertainment's maybe a special case because it's one of these industries that's really taken a lot from the development of communications technology. I mean, compare it with something like healthcare, and you don't there's plenty of people who can't access good healthcare without paying a lot of money. So we want to be a bit careful. But yeah, there are these sort of, when you take a sort of global view, there are these positive tendencies, and we don't want to. I guess we don't want to lose that. But of course, as things change, there are people who lose out, right? I mean, and this is a point made about trade, especially, which is a large part of globalization. If the jobs, if the car making industry packs up in Melbourne or Geelong or wherever it is, and goes to South Korea or something, or Thailand, that might mean that cars end up being cheaper and maybe a bit better. But that's small beer for the people who've lost out, right? And you see this repeatedly in other countries. You see it in England, where I grew up, the coal mining industry packed up, and people said, "Oh, it's progress, cheaper coal from ours." This means nothing to the people who lose out unless something is done to help them. You see the same thing now in the US with the decline of, well, so it's been a long, slow decline, really, of manufacturing in places like the Midwest. There are these.
And it destroys communities entirely.
It certainly can do. Yeah, it certainly can do. And there's all this enthusiasm. I mean, you mentioned neoliberalism. I would say.
It's one of those words.
Yeah, it is a little bit. But I would say, let's just say, enthusiasm for trade that's preoccupied with the kind of global macro effects often involves overlooking, the local effects in particular locations, or just being dismissive of them in ways that's basically unjust. I mean, yeah, we do want the benefits of globalization, but it's gonna, just because there's this net overall benefit, it doesn't mean that there aren't pockets of quite serious harm that arguably something should be done about. And I mean, one fashionable view is that, well, this shows we need a bit of socialism, right? We need the state to take more control. That's one way of arguing for socialism. But another problem is that, from a Adam Smith sort of view, from a pro-market point of view, what we might want is to create more opportunities for the people who've lost out. And one problem in the United States is it's actually very hard to move locations, because you cross a state border and all of the rules about what job you can do and what kind of licenses you need change. So there are maybe we do need redistribution of wealth to solve some of these problems, but we might also want to lower barriers to entry for certain new paths in life for people. And I don't want to say the second views should be adopted instead of the first, but it's more easily overlooked, because redistribution always springs to mind quite easily, because we're told about the wealth inequalities. It's visible to us that there are rich and poor, but the idea that there's a barrier to you entering a certain profession because you haven't got the right kind of license, or because it's very hard for you to move home and get the kids out of school, and that's less visible to the average person. So I'd just sort of say something in favor of taking that perspective a bit more seriously.
Yeah, I think there is something that maybe we haven't given enough credit to here as well. So the critique of distributing the income in a sort of via government, without some kind of labor, is going to be that that the person may not have the good habits, or the job, having a job might somehow teach them how to manage their money better, or something along these lines. I can imagine someone saying something like this. If I can also see there's merit in this argument. If you just throw $1,000 at someone, unless they have the right habits, that they could just piss that money down the toilet, essentially, right?
Yeah. So one thing you hear from the politicians in Australia is that the best form of welfare is a job, right? Which is, close to the sort of view you're talking about. The idea that, look, keeping someone in work keeps them disciplined, teaches them management. Giving someone money for nothing will have some kind of, it won't do that and may make them worse off. There's a lot we could say about this. I mean, no one seems to think, if that argument is right, people shouldn't be allowed to inherit money because it'll do the same, it'll do the same thing. Now, why would we think that universal basic income, money from the state's revenues, would have this bad effect, but money from your parents wouldn't? It's money, right? We could have a long conversation about this. We could talk about ways in which parents might, pass money to children only after and during some kind of process of education. But it's not as if the state actually takes more responsibility for educating people in many ways than parents. So I'm just skeptical that giving someone money will, as you put it, cause them to fritter it away and squander it. People can do that kind of thing whilst in paid employment. I think that the classical liberal view, the sort of view that Adam Smith would have is associated with, would have said, look, what really makes the difference is social norms and attitudes, okay, and habits, and what we really want. We shouldn't expect the regulation of the market and the redistribution of wealth to be the driver of that. And it ultimately is speculative to say. Here's one bit of evidence that I like. When people retire, in the early years of their retirement, when they're still quite, physically able, they get out and do stuff. They do charity work. They do the sort of stuff that they wish they could have done when they were stuck having to work full time. Now, that's actually a pretty good bit of evidence because a lot of people do that. And if anything, people who are 10 or 20 years younger would be even more, physically capable. And look, you'll always be able to find someone. You'll be able to find welfare recipients or basic income recipients who muck around and waste it, just the same as you can find wealthy rich kids who do that, frankly.
I don't have the stat for this though, but I have heard someone say that actually they've found that unemployed. Now this might have something to do with the fact that they don't have income in the first place, but that unemployed men, working age, they actually do less charity work than their employed counterparts, which, would maybe, not necessarily, but potentially call that into question a little bit.
It may do, but when you're unemployed under a welfare state, such as we have in Australia, you're under constant pressure to try and find a job. If you were not under that pressure, you might do things differently. And, at the end of the day, this is all comparative. Okay, maybe, universal basic income is going to create some time wasters, freeloaders, and there's a serious question about what you do with someone once you've already given them money and they still mess their life up. But what's the cost benefit analysis compared to the welfare state? I mean, proponents of basic income are going to argue with some force that, look, you'll be able to find cases like this, under the status quo without basic income. It's not as if there's this pretense that sometimes that the welfare state sort of keeps everyone honest and does its job well, but it's not obviously true. There's counter examples on both sides. And, the debate, you can never really settle these questions until we try and do the thing, which we might do now. That, if coronavirus is the biggest shock to the economy, and, certainly since before either of us were born, big shocks change what's politically feasible. They actually give governments a lot more latitude. They make governments less of a sort of slave to their past rhetoric. You had the education minister, he's saying childcare is going to be free during COVID. He'd earlier said the Labour Party were on a path to communism for making childcare free to some subset of people at a low income. So it's not as if he's decided he's gone away and read Marx and decided he's now a communist, because it's because the political winds have changed. And so look, we don't really know the answer to these. Both of these kinds of systems, a welfare state system and a basic income system, are going to have downsides. They're going to be downsides that are hard to really compare unless you've tried both. But the kinds of downsides that people perceive with basic income are downsides that you see in other walks of life where someone subsidizes someone else.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the real virtue of the basic income system is, you're not deciding what goods people are going to get. You're not doing a sort of mini command and control economy within certain sectors. So you're going to maintain a kind of price signaling. And also, you're not tyrannizing people and telling them what they ought to do with the resources that you're assigning them, right?
Yes.
Which I think, a massive benefits that you can argue from for that.
A way of extending that reasoning in an Australian context. What we have in Australia is we have a huge country, really sparsely populated, by global standards. But, large parts of it are still inhabitable. And yet everyone's trying to squeeze into Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, right? Because that's where the jobs are.
Yeah.
Now, if there was basic income, one of the real virtues of basic income that is often, I think, downplayed a bit compared to some of its other alleged virtues, is that it will really enhance freedom of movement. You can go where you want. And in fact, you might well go to the country because it's cheaper there. And it's cheaper there because there's no jobs, or there's fewer jobs, or less well-paid jobs. But you'd expect it to still be somewhat cheaper under basic income. And, this might actually transform the landscape, literally the landscape, the geographical distribution of people and capital. And this doesn't get, in Australian context, this is important because we've got these great big overcrowded cities, and then we've got this big long gap to these sort of country towns, which you don't see in somewhere like Europe or North America. And this could really be a good thing for Australia. I'm being speculative, but it's something I'd like to see discussed a bit more often.
No, I think that's a really good point, and it's confusing that it's still going on. It's not like the situation's getting better, but you would have thought, because of the internet, it matters less that you're right next to each other, and perhaps this is going to be another thing that comes out of this COVID situation, is people are going to be more used to using remote technologies like Zoom.
Yeah.
And they're going to feel less like they need to be next to everybody else in the financial hub of whatever major city it is.
Yes, I think that's right. And, there are already benefits from the enhanced communications technology, and use of these technologies is going to be more normalized coming out of the pandemic. But, proponents of basic income are still going to say there's no substitute for not actually needing a job. Of course, you're free to get a job. I mean, a lot of people who receive basic income will still want jobs, but they'll have that bit of freedom to take a bit of time out of the labour market, go try living somewhere else, and that could have all sorts of beneficial effects, as well as being beneficial for the individuals concerned.
So, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about where price signaling goes wrong as well. I think that could be an interesting area. What do you think about that, and what role do taxes and regulations play in a healthy system?
Right. Well, it might be good to very quickly rehearse the argument in Hayek, right, in just a few sentences, which is that the price of something tells you how scarce it is and how much people want it, right? So when something's expensive, as long as you don't manipulate the prices, the government says, look, charge what you like. When something gets expensive, that's valuable information for people to produce more of it, and for people who don't really need it to not buy it, and then someone else can buy it. The example discussed in the textbook is ice for refrigeration purposes after a hurricane. Right? Hurricane knocks out the power, and the people who've got diabetes need to keep their medication cool, and the ice gets really expensive. But that means that the diabetics can buy it because the sort of beer drinkers aren't going to bother, and someone else is going to respond to that price signal and produce more ice and get the supply back up. Right? But the law.
This got some really heated tutorial discussions.
It does, and that's sort of the idea, right? But this example might be quite a red herring, or this example suits the Hayekian argument because ice is the kind of thing that. So in the first place, there are some people who really, really need it, the small minority who've got diabetes, let's say, and there's a whole load of people who sort of don't really need it but kind of want it, but will not buy it if the price goes up. The beer drinkers, and so there's that feature. There's also the feature that it is actually relatively easy for people to get into the market and make more ice. Okay, if they've just got to drive it from wherever they can find a freezer into the affected, geographic area. So that example really sort of helps make the point that the price signal has a good effect. But not all goods and services are like ice. So we probably do remember when this pandemic got going, everyone went and the toilet paper went.
Yeah.
Now, toilet paper is not even it's not expensive, right? So if the price of toilet paper had been cranked to, I don't know, $50 a roll or something, people would have held back a bit and it would have preserved the supply. But it's a tricky case because on the one hand, there isn't this differential between people who use toilet paper because they really need it and people who just sort of use it for something frivolous. Everyone kind of uses it for the
Hmm.
same thing. So you don't have that feature of the example. And also, it turned the reason toilet paper disappeared from the shelves is because it's a really big item. It's the biggest item you normally, if you've got a family of 4 like me, it's the biggest thing in the shopping cart, right? It's not the most important thing might be other stuff, but it's hard for supermarkets to keep large supplies of toilet paper on the shelf. Hard for truck to fill a
Hmm.
truck and bring it out. It's so it's unlike ice in that the supply can quickly respond to the spike in the spike in the price. So actually, goods and services really vary in terms of how consumers are going to behave. A rising price won't always sort of sift the wheat from the chaff in terms of, it won't always force out a bunch of consumers who don't really need it. And it won't always be such that other producers can quickly get into the game. So, what's true for ice is not really true for toilet paper. So we've just got to be a bit careful about how far we think this argument can take us. Now, what someone like Hayek will still suggest is that none of this is any reason to think that the government has got access to special information about who needs toilet
Right,
paper.
right,
So this
yeah.
isn't an argument for socialism, or this is an argument for the socialist idea of don't let the market regulate, don't let the market distribute things, have central government do it, because
Hmm.
although it's true that the market is not going to work as quickly for some goods and services than others, it's probably still going to work better than government. Maybe
Yeah.
toilet papers. Maybe you could have a bureaucrat sit down and work out.
Yes, yes, yes. We're going to deliver everybody, 4 rolls of
Yeah,
toilet paper a
maybe
week.
it could be done, but the point is,
But I mean, then again, someone might accidentally, they might get wet, or you might forget where you left them, and
that's
then,
right.
you know,
Yeah. So, but the point, to answer your question, price signals. It's clear that they do send a certain kind of signal, but how quickly that signal gets responded to and how effective the response is in sort of ensuring that who needs the stuff gets it, that's a bit more up for debate than some of these examples might suggest. But that's why it's good to discuss these things. And one of the things I like teaching this material is, every once in a while you get an event like toilet paper that sort of enhances the discussion, but also everyone who comes to the class has got their own experiences and got their own examples. And one thing that Smith and Hayek, if this is sort of parallel with the point that the government doesn't know everything, because everyone on the ground sort of does know something that other people perhaps don't know, and the point is to listen to each other.
yeah, yeah. So there's this confusing view that some people seem to have, that you need to be educated in order to for the economy to operate, but that's not true. You just need to know what you want, and then
When it comes to the consumption of
go after
private
it.
good, when it comes to things like toilet paper and ice, it gets a little bit. Someone's got to make a decision about the cost of borrowing, right? And someone's got to make a decision, about how to design the tax system. And actually, that does take a lot of the government. This goes back to the point about free market being a misnomer, as if the market just has this kind of as if the market's like the force, a natural force like gravity, and government just gets in the way. Well, government sometimes gets in the way, which is arguably what happens when it stipulates prices for bags of ice. But government actually makes the market happen as we know it by making decisions about infrastructure, the money supply, all these things that are involve coercive law and require taxation, but aren't really ways of interfering with the market. They're really more ways of making cooperation more possible.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. There's another thing that often gets brought up in these conversations about price signaling, which is this idea of you know externalities. There's a transaction, but really there's another hidden transaction that's going on, which is the two people involved in the transaction are somehow screwing over some other group of people. They're not telling them that they should really be involved in the transaction, right? This is so the idea here is maybe they're making some deal, but this company's polluting the local river, and so really the whole community should is implicated in this transaction, but they're sort of all getting money taken away from them in some sense.
Yeah. So generally speaking, transactions occur between, consenting parties, let's say, but there are externalities by way of costs and benefits incurred in a sort of involuntary way by third parties, right, who may not be expecting them or prepared for them. And in fact, my neighbour has transacted with some tradies to get their kitchen renovated, and that's created a lot of noise over the last few days in my apartment, which has made it hard for me to record. Thankfully, it's not interrupted our conversation. But
Hmm.
I was kind of hoping it would interrupt, just so we could say, "Oh, there's an externality." Um, um, but look, what do we say? Externalities are a problem for anyone who's a proponent of market order, right? Because the original case for capitalism relies on this idea that, compared to feudalism, this is going to make us all better off. Well, compared to feudalism, yeah, probably yes, almost certainly yes, it has done. But look, there are these downsides that perhaps you didn't get under feudalism when there wasn't just so much industry and transactions going on, right? So the question is, what do you do about? Well, one strategy is to try and design the tax system so that the costs of externalities are actually absorbed by the transacting parties. So to, if you like, convert an externality into an internality. It's not a word, but that's what the carbon tax did. Okay, the
Hmm.
carbon tax was designed to reduce carbon emissions. In a way, it's not about getting someone else to absorb the cost of those emissions, right? It's to get someone else to absorb a cost when they make an emission, so that they don't make the emission, and so they don't have to absorb the cost, right? So it's not it's a bit more complicated than just transferring the cost over. But that's, taxes on certain kinds of damaging.
Although, I mean, if you could perfectly price in the cost, then maybe you would want to do that, right? Like, I mean, the problem is people will have some degree of difficulty telling what, you know, the exact damage of emitting this much CO2 is going to be in the future. But ideally, if it was perfectly priced in, then, the dynamics of the market might work in a way that makes sense
Oh,
in that
one
situation.
view is that, look, even though it might be very difficult to figure out what sort of uh, cost you should impose on someone making the externality, putting that in place will encourage the market rules. Like, it's almost like a price signal, will encourage the development of some alternative transaction that doesn't, because typically an
Hmm.
externality is not the point of the transaction, right? People
Yeah,
don't fill their car with petrol and drive it in order to pollute. That's just not what people are doing. So
yeah.
the thought is that it's not a tax on the activity, it's a tax on the activity when it generates the externality. So a carbon tax would have been an incentive to people for the market to produce more green energy solutions. Yeah. Um, and that's not to be scoffed at. It would create that incentive. It doesn't mean it's easy for the incentive to
Hmm.
be responded to, but more likely to be responded to with the carbon tax than without it. That's for sure.
Yeah. There was one other thing I forgot to talk about before when we were going down this the path of talking about what went
Mm.
wrong, after the early '70s, which is there also is this question about planned obsolescence, and that we don't have any reasonable incentive for companies to just shut themselves down once they've solved a particular problem. And that seems to me to be one of the biggest flaws in our current
Mm.
system, right? You want to be able to incentivize people to solve a problem, and then it's done.
Yes. So there's an argument for socialism here, right? Under capitalism, or any approximation of it, companies will be victims of their own success, right? If they produce something that's really good, such that the customer's kind of permanently satisfied, they won't come back to buy anything else. And so you see with, particularly electrical goods, they're built to break. And they may break in various ways, but they're all designed carefully so that the customer comes back for more. And you compare that. So there was a documentary called The Light Bulb Conspiracy, which is really worth watching about this. And one of the many examples in that documentary is of these refrigerators built in Eastern Europe, built in East Germany in the 1980s, and they still work. Now,
Hmm.
they worked when the documentary was made, which was less than 10 years ago. So
And there's over 100-year-old light bulb in a fire department in a town in the United States as well.
yes, because light bulbs didn't
Yeah.
used to break. That was just the manufacturers thought they better make them breakable, otherwise they would run out of customers. So there's this argument for socialism that, because businesses are not having to sort of, there aren't really businesses under socialism. It's just the state, I suppose. You don't need to make things to break. You can just make them to last. And these East German fridges are actually testament to that. I don't know how energy efficient these fridges are, but nonetheless, they still work, which is impressive. So yeah, that looks like a bit of a flaw in the market, right? And yeah, we talk about this in the book, but it's not entirely clear. And it is a pain, right? It's a pain for the consumer as well. It's not just about externalities. It's not just about waste and pollution. It's a pain when your laptop breaks and you have to buy a new one, when you kind of know it needn't have been designed to break that quickly. And there are some more puzzling examples like fashion and how I don't really follow fashion, but clothes become obsolescent because they look wrong, not because they don't keep you warm anymore.
Yeah.
So what to do about this? Well, there are different ways of going. One view is that, but there's still progress, right? Yeah, so it's a pain when something breaks, but when you get the replacement, it is better, right? And imagine that if cars in the 1920s had just been the last cars. Well, there'd be less, they'd be slower, there'd be more pollution, there'd be really much more dangerous if you get into a crash. And that's just to pick one example. But one view is that, look, it's a pain in the short term, but it drives progress in the long term. That's one view. And sometimes that's probably right. Another view is that, look, it's just a bit of maybe this is a necessary evil. Maybe we can't have companies and production if we don't have this. But we don't really want to have socialism because of all the other downsides. So it's just some kind of compromise. Maybe we just say to manufacturers, yeah, okay, you can build this to break, but you have to just comply with some conditions that mean the consumer's a bit more protected. So you have to, things like warranties, right? Maybe the laptop has to last for 5 years instead of 2 years or something like that. So one view is that this is actually a necessary evil of capitalism or market order, but it's something we've just got to live with, and we can regulate it accordingly. A bit like unemployment. I mean, there's always going to be unemployment under capitalism as opposed to socialism, but you might think that, look, with the right kind of regulation, the right kind of compensation for people who are unfortunate, we still have a better system overall. But I'm glad you brought this up, because this goes back to the fact that the triangle and the idea that capitalism is an extreme point in the triangle. You might actually find out that even if you're sort of lean towards capitalism, or you think that there are good defenses of market order, very, very hard to come up with an argument for why we should completely have a completely pure system of capitalism because of examples like this. Yeah. Now, I'm not sure if my co-author would have the same view about that, but however far you can go in defending capitalism, you probably can't defend every single bit of it unequivocally.
Is he pretty hardcore libertarian?
Well, the trouble with libertarians is libertarians aren't really about capitalism. They're just about freedom. I mean, libertarians have got no means of really, the kind of libertarians you come across in philosophy tend to be of the view that, private property is really important and contracts really important. Economic freedoms are really important. But they don't really care about competition. They don't really have theoretical resources to explain why it's a bad thing that planned obsolescence exists, or even much worse stuff like, naked collusion to fix prices. I mean, that's just companies exercising their property rights. Who cares? They don't really have a way of. Libertarians don't defend markets; they defend individual rights. And there's a difference. There's a really big difference, even though that's not immediately obvious to students or indeed to professional philosophers a lot of the time. Markets aren't just about freedom; they're about a balance between freedom and competition, and that's what makes the pro-capitalist view different from a sort of libertarian view, I would say.
Okay. So, and the capitalist is leaning more towards the markets.
Yeah, capitalism is about finding a balance between freedom and, as per the triangle, capitalism is about finding a balance between economic freedom, property and contract, and competition, so that rather than just have markets enrich some people and extract wealth from others, markets actually do what they can to promote, production and innovation, and give people a leg up, give people a way out of poverty, do something to, competition is really quite close to the idea of equality of opportunity, which is regarded as something, closer to socialism, but it needn't be.
Okay, yeah. So I think I want to sort of ask you now. We've talked about a lot of the issues. I think there's one more thing that's sort of big in our current system, which is marketing, but maybe we can leave that for the moment because I want to, it's not obviously bad, but I think, it is a way to engineer people to have incentives and want things that they might otherwise not care about. But leaving that on the side, what do you think should be done? At this point,
What do I
to change the status quo for the better, to make it more ethical?
Well, we could get rid of some of the legacies of feudalism. I mean, my answer to this is going to be rather more controversial than the kind of claims we make in the book. But if we taxed inherited wealth, Australia has no tax on inherited wealth.
Yeah, it's
A
crazy.
large tax on income. Now, why on earth are we taxing income from work more than income you get for nothing? Okay. Now, I'm not saying inheritance should be eliminated, but we should really begin to tax it. I think that would be good, and that would be a pro-capitalist thing, as I've explained, and as is fairly easy to explain, that a tax on market activity like income is different. Going to be viewed quite differently under any pro-market view from a tax on something else. So I think we should do something about that. I think we've got to be a bit more serious about positional competition, and this goes back to things like private education. Although private education is actually in some ways more complex than it looks, it is a problem when you've got parents spending loads and loads of money just to keep up with each other, or so their kids can keep up with each other, while some other kids are left behind. I think markets in education are problematic, even if they again shouldn't be prohibited. They're problematic under the status quo.
What do you think about what is often proposed in the United States, not quite to as radical extent as I might, but sort of a school choice. Let's say you say each kid in the society is going to get X amount of dollars to go towards their education, and that's all we're going to say. Whatever educational institution of whatever description they end up at, that money will go to them.
There's pros and cons with that view. I mean, it's one way of trying to put a limit on a positional competition, right? It's one way of sort of capping expenditure. There's something to be said for that. Although one way, in some ways, a better way to try and dampen positional competition in the case of education is not to cap it, but to postpone its commencement, right? So don't test kids so early in life. Don't put parents in a situation where they're already wondering about what nursery school to send their kid. The voucher thing's not really about that. The voucher thing's about capping. But if we just didn't really do that much by way of testing and ranking, markets in education exist as a response to the ranking of students or the ranking of children. Now, ranking's got to occur sooner or later, because at the end of the day, education has to filter people according to what who's good at what. But it doesn't have to start nearly as early as it does. And if it started later, the incentive to spend money would start a bit later. So I actually prefer approaches of that sort. Now, you could combine that with a voucher thing. I don't find the voucher thing, I don't regard that as necessary or the only sort of pathway towards improving the status quo in a country like Australia.
So you were talking about solutions to the system before I interrupted you. As it currently stands, what we can improve. So you had inheritance, and then removing positional goods, especially with regards to education.
Not removing positional goods, but just taking more seriously the wasteful and unjust tendencies of uncontrolled positional competition. Taxing inheritance would be good, and we've got to get better at housing. So a lot of Australian tax law, and I won't go into the details here, but most of us have heard of negative gearing and the ability of homeowners to, the way in which there's an incentive for people to own more homes than they're going to live in. That's not a good thing. That doesn't produce anything. Okay, all it does. So this goes back to David Ricardo and Adam Smith and feudalism, right? And the idea that, look, it's problematic when you've got wealthy people extracting wealth from less wealthy people, which is unjust or unfair, but it's also not productive. Nothing comes out of this at the other end. Okay, investing in property so you can get money off of renters is being incentivized by the tax system to some degree, but you want people to invest in things that are you want people to invest in whatever makes the coronavirus vaccine, in things like that. You want people to invest in entities that solve problems. Buying up all the housing, or buying up more housing than you're going to live in, it doesn't do that. It doesn't. It just creates an imbalance whereby wealth moves from one person to another. It does not produce anything new, and that's that. People really haven't got. People are negative gearing is controversial because people feel like it's the rich, it's the rich extracting from the poor. But I think in a way, the more classical point, the point that you get in Smith and Ricardo is nothing comes out of this. So why incentivize it? Why incentivize something that creates nothing?
Yeah, absolutely. And so we have inheritance, positional goods, and housing.
I'll give you some
Have you
more.
got? Yeah,
What,
yeah.
yeah,
No, I want the new
uh,
theory, the system 2.0. If you've got one.
well, I don't know if I've got a whole theory apart from like try and change the status quo in ways that promote competition and take away privilege. Right?
Hmm.
I mean, that's what these policies would do. Take away privilege and take away incentives to waste. Positional competitions are largely wasteful. They're not always wasteful, but they have wasteful tendencies. We've got to look carefully at the extent to which they do and reduce that. Untaxed inheritance is really just going to prop up privilege. A little bit of inheritance might be a good thing, right? And I actually go into that in the book
Yeah.
that you mentioned. What else? Gambling, for heaven's sake. I mean, Australia's a funny old place, right? It's a world leader on being paternalistic about putting alcohol and tobacco in your body. And we could go back and forth about whether that's whether Australia's got it right, but it's a world leader on that. But gambling, no, you just don't see any paternalism there. You don't, and you certainly don't see. The government is actually, my understanding is that local state governments get a tax revenue from gambling, which they don't quote me on that perhaps, but I think the incentives are different when it comes to local governments with regard to gambling than they are to these other quote unquote vices, and that's a problem. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more ethical when it's at least going to the government, though. So I think the lotto in the United States, I think all of the money from that goes towards social programs of some just
That's a good point. That's a good point. And you can do things with tax. I mean, the word is hypothecation, but you can tie certain taxes to certain expenditures in ways that might be morally significant. But if you want a grand theory out of me, I think I would suggest to students or to everyone that a lot of what's unjust in contemporary Australia and contemporary a lot of places, ask first not whether it would be solved by more government control or something like socialism. And maybe it would. I'm not saying that's wrong, but ask whether can you trace this to some kind of failure of the need to balance freedom and competition. And if an injustice is traceable to that, you shouldn't blame it on capitalism. You should probably blame it on some kind of quasi-feudalism or some kind of hangover from the past, or even some way in which we're actually reverting to a feudal history. And I would say economic justice is not the only kind of justice. A lot of what Australia needs to talk about. We've had all this controversy lately. Well, it's always been there, but it's come to a head about changing street names, getting rid of statues. The point is, economic justice is not everything. It's a big part of justice, but it's not everything. Where there's economic injustice, I want to get people to think more about this balance of freedom and competition and where that fits into things.
Although the more we lean into a capitalist system, the more economic justice matters relative to other forms, because we're taking the power away from politics and sort of distributing it out into the market in some sense.
You might say
right?
that, yeah. You might well say that, and that's probably going to lead us to conclude that we shouldn't lean in so far that we stop caring about some of the inevitable downsides of market order, like we talked about planned obsolescence and externalities and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I would agree with
that. So I was wondering, given that you on this point of thinking about how we could adjust certain things to maybe enhance competition or correct for things that might be going wrong in the current system. Have you read radical markets at
Oh,
all.
the Whale and Posner. Yeah, yes,
Yes.
I've not read it awfully. Any book that was published after the birth of my first child, I'm not sure if that one was. But anyway, yes, I know the basic idea. Yes.
What do you think about
So
that?
I take the basic idea to be that whenever you've got property, you declare its value, its financial value, such that you pay a
Hmm.
tax. You know, the higher the value you declare, the higher the tax you pay, but you
Hmm.
have to sell it at that value if someone wants to come along and buy it.
Yeah.
You know, if I want to hang on to my house, well, if I've got a house, I can either declare it at a low value and not pay any real tax on it, or declare it at a high, you know, and sell it to somebody who wants to come along and buy it, or I can declare it at a high value and, you know, enhance my prospects of hanging on to it, but pay more tax accordingly. Do I think it's a
And it's set up in such a way that you sit in an equilibrium position where it doesn't make sense for you to value it higher than you actually value it or lower than you actually value it.
That's the idea, yeah.
And so
What do I think about that?
because I really like it, I think it's a very interesting idea.
I think I quite like it. I think again, it's one of these cases. It's one of these ideas where the details have not really been worked out, and the defense of it goes straight for the
Hmm.
big picture. What I mean by that is that, you know, houses and cars and other things, they might just be different in interesting ways that count against, you know, this kind of thing, right? So, for example, if I own a house but I have two small children who are very, you know, attached to their local friends and their school and all that, is it unfair? You know, does that just mean I should be prepared to pay more tax on the house? Now, that might be a bit unfair, you might think. Or someone, you know, people have reasons for wanting to stay in a location that aren't necessarily captured by the financial value of the asset, of an asset like a house.
Hmm.
You know, and you might just think that that's a bit of an externality. If, you know, if a child has to undergo a dislocation just because their parent wasn't willing to pay, able or willing to pay more tax, is a bit unfair. But you wouldn't say that about other assets. You wouldn't say it about an oil painting, something like that. I just think
Hmm.
it's a nice idea, and there is, they talk about monopoly being everywhere, which is a sort of
Hmm.
interesting claim. You know,
Hmm.
another view is that there's only one house like the house that you're in, I suppose, and in that way, houses are different again from things like cars and other kinds of assets. So I think that there needs to be a bit of sensitivity to what kind of assets people are talking about, and what kind of reasons people might have for that bear on what they're going to value them at. But that's about all.
Yeah, I can see where you're coming from there. Yeah, for sure. It does present this sort of very radical position that, you know, you really shouldn't be attached to much of anything that you own, maybe in terms of, you know, your property. And to the extent that you are, you just have to be willing to to pay more to keep that stuff if you really want to.
Yes, and maybe
And, you know, you could maybe have an exclusion for some provision of, you know, personal goods that is excluded from that. But I think that their argument would be is the house has to be included because maybe someone, I think the example they give at the start of the book, wants to build a railway, let's say, through, and that the whole point is this system would allow them to just buy the property at a price that is reasonable without being gouged.
yeah. So it solves certain problems.
Mm.
That being one of them. But look, again, there are going to be differences between people's reasons for valuing an asset at a certain level, and there's a worry here that you privilege the micro over the macro, right? You look, you know, you focus on, well, people shouldn't be so attached to things, and maybe that's right. That raises a question about how social norms have, you know, got us to where we are, and a lot of these analyses, it's easy for them to forget that social norms are a force, and you know, there's our reasons for valuing certain things, and there's just the kind of culture we inhabit, and how that might act as a certain kind of barrier to changing things, at least changing them quickly. But the privileging of the micro over the macro, well, look, if everyone's moving home all the time, if not all the time, but very, very frequently, that might have bad effects on community. It might just
Hmm.
do things that are harder to anticipate. Um,
Yeah.
you know, and there is one of the problems with rental markets actually is that poorer people do have to move house an awful lot, and that means it's harder for them to become politically, to build a political coalition. So take the University of Melbourne. There's a wealthy suburb just to the west in Parkville. You don't see any high-rise buildings in Parkville, even though that is, a good place to put a high-rise building. It's near.
It is. It's a great
The
place.
town centre, and I know we've talked earlier about it'd be good if not everyone had to crowd into cities, but as long as they do, But the residents of Parkville are going to be relatively organised because they've all lived there a long. Many of them have lived there a long time, and it's easy for them to mount cooperative opposition to these kinds of policies, and they don't get the high rise in their backyard, and everyone's on the on the freeway commuting out to the edge of town. But that's not something that poorer people have a harder time doing that because they're often bouncing from place to place a bit more. And so one wonders whether something like the radical markets proposal, how would it impact on that kind of thing? Would it be on balance better or worse because of it? It's a speculative point, but one wonders. These things are hard to fit into the analysis. And
I mean, I think that it would perhaps even out the playing field there, and that those rich people might not be able to stop people from buying out their property anymore if they didn't want them to, but it might have larger negative effects on this community, or the communities forming in meaningful ways. And a lot of our lives, perhaps we don't want them to be explicitly transactional, I think is what you're saying.
Or that there are costs to there being lots of transactions all the time. And really the point is just that anyone who wants to defend this radical markets view is interesting, but if its defense is to be carried further, some of this work's going to have to get done. And you see in other elements of life a resistance to transactions just because they're exhausting. I mean, the example from Jonathan Wolf's work is you get on a crowded tram. Social norms really go against the idea of someone saying, "Do you want my seat for $10?" You don't see that, even though there's nothing particularly sacred. It's not like trying to sell a body part or something. I mean, after all, the seat is in a sense already been sold, right? When someone bought a ticket and sat on it. But you just don't see that, and I suppose there's a reason for that. It's hard to pin down exactly what the reason is, but a social norm of that sort that just says, "Look, stop buying and selling stuff all the time," might be good for us. And maybe that goes some way towards. That's a challenge that any view that wants to kind of increase the tendency for us to buy and sell assets in the name of efficiency or even fairness. These are the sort of things I'd like you'd want to see them grapple with a bit more.
So I'm running up the end of the time that we've allotted here. There's one last question that I want to ask you, and then I want to see ask you to you can sort of put out whatever you would like to say. And so the sort of last thing I think we should touch on. What do you think about the newer technologies in terms of the potential good outcomes and how they could be used to structure the system in a more ethical way? So things like something that came up was the Michael Munger book, I think, and also cryptocurrencies.
Right. So Michael Munger's interested in these. I've got whatever it is, a power drill that sits in my garage for years on end, never gets used, and that's just even though I had to pay for the whole thing. So he thinks that sharing stuff's just going to be really efficient. He's probably right about a lot of that. And we've already seen it. We have seen a bit of this already in the world, thanks to communications technology. So that's a force for good in many ways. But there'll be at the same time there's this concern about the digital platforms allowing firms to treat workers as non-employees in ways that might not actually be as attractive from an ethical point of view. So it's going to depend on what kind of exchanges the technology is going to be facilitating. Right? It's going to be, so there's the short, boring answer is there's going to be good stuff and bad stuff, and we'll just have to work through the cases carefully and try and build some kind of theory of how we regulate this kind of stuff accordingly. Cryptocurrency. I don't know a whole lot about cryptocurrency. My understanding of it, what I do know about it, is limited to having read some of the material about the dark web and the idea that cryptocurrency is going to make illegal transactions in illegal stuff more feasible. And my understanding again is that it does that to a certain extent, but because it's not real currency, you can't really stop the broker from running away, absconding with all the you buy, if you want to buy something illegal, you give the cryptocurrency to a third party, right? They give
Hmm.
it to the supplier once you receive the illegal thing, or legal thing,
Hmm.
I suppose. But once this broker gets successful and starts building up a certain supply that they haven't, a certain amount of cryptocurrency, there's incentive for them to run away and just keep it, right? And that would appear to be a limiting factor. That would appear to be what would stop cryptocurrencies from wholly displacing the Australian dollar. The
Although it's worth mentioning that those markets have functioned reasonably well for illegal goods. I mean that the transactions do go through and drugs get dealt in,
I believe
right?
they do, but the more successful the broker becomes, right, the more incentive there is for them to caught play and run
Yeah.
off. Partly because the law enforcement's going to be on their back, right?
Have you got any other thoughts on cryptocurrencies
It's always
stuff?
been a question. I mean, I've sort of suggested that we take it for granted that the government controls the money supply, right? And historically, countries where the government is a sort of a robust and trusted controller of the money supply have done well. But maybe those times are going to change. Um,
Hmm.
we'll have to see. Is there anything we haven't covered that you'd like us to touch on?
Well, there's this one thinker as well, Nassim Taleb. Have you come across him at
Yeah,
all?
he's a current thinker. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
I've
yeah.
come across him, but I don't know a whole lot about. I've heard a couple of podcasts. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, he's a sort of Adam Smith person, I understand. But
Yeah, I find he makes a very interesting argument that sort of goes beyond price signaling for the market as well. He argues fundamentally that the system is anti-fragile. He uses this word anti-fragile, which he defines as the opposite of fragility. If you expose an anti-fragile system to disorder, then it becomes stronger than it was before. And the sort of mythological analogy is, um, you know, something that's resilient would be like a phoenix, but something that's anti-fragile is like a hydra. Two heads grow back.
I do.
Um,
Mm.
and so the idea here is that when you try and do central planning, you're setting up a fundamentally fragile system because in some way it is going to be weak to a particular kind of disorder that a distributed network won't be. Um,
I mean, that's a bit metaphorical, but I think I get the point. That sounds like one way of trying to further the sort of Smith Hayek line about spontaneous
mhm.
order. I wouldn't. I'd have to hear more about how it goes, how it's more than just a metaphor before I'd have a view about it. But yeah, it's good for it's good for there to be more scholarship on spontaneous order, and because most orders are not completely spontaneous. That's, for me, that's one of the take home messages. I mean, there are things like natural languages which really did get here without anyone really being in control, and which can't really be improved from the outside, even though some are better than others. Um, and then there are markets which are a bit more, well, there's more qualifications.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you there. Although he takes a fairly radical stance on that position and a very interesting one. So I think it's obviously, and now that you're a father, I'm sure you've got lots of things uh, to do. But if you can manage to squeeze in his
Yeah,
book there as well, that's worthwhile.
I'd
I
like
think.
to read more of that stuff. Radical. One thing I will say is the academic industry is its own positional competition, and everyone's competing for attention.
Yeah.
And being radical gets you attention.
Right. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
so there's sort of, especially when it comes to writing books, not so much writing articles because the editors don't care because they've already sold their product to libraries. But the popular social science, you lose count of the number of books that are supposedly changing the conversation and revolution. Why can't we just have the conversation?
Yeah.
Why do we
Yeah.
have to change it the whole time? So again, one of the nice things about writing a textbook is you're not under this pressure to kind of be the next big thing, or even the second, the next second biggest thing. It's just what are the questions that are out there, and how to best approach them, and it's quite a nice thing to write, and hopefully a nice thing to read.
Yeah, I think you've got the virtue of talking about the ethics of capitalism, people think that's an oxymoron. So that's how you can be instantaneously controversial, but then you come in with a very sort of
We don't want to be
level-headed
controversial, though.
analysis.
We don't want to. We just want to be, yeah, hopefully just drawing people's attention to things that they're actually already quite well disposed to accepting, rather than trying to change people's minds about the deeper issues.
So I know we're running up the end of our time here, and you're a busy man, so I better let you go. Thank you so much.
Josh, thank you.
Catch
See you
up.
later.